In the midst of life's chaos, we all seek true peace. Today, you will walk the path that leads to genuine serenity, where your soul can find rest and worries fade away. Relax, listen closely, and let this journey unfold before you. If this message touches your heart, remember to like, share, and subscribe to join us on more enlightening journeys. Music. It's almost certain that in the rush of life, we all find ourselves weary, as if carrying invisible burdens. These could be work pressures, family worries, anxieties about the future, or even the sorrows and mistakes of the past that are hard to shake off. These burdens accumulate, weighing us down and disturbing our inner peace. In moments of solitude and exhaustion, Jesus' invitation in Matthew resonates with gentleness, intimacy, and deep empathy. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. This is not a promise that all difficulties will vanish instantly, but a tender, loving solace. He invites us to come not to be judged, but to share our burdens with Him. The rest that God offers is not merely physical relaxation, but a profound peace within the soul, a sense of being sheltered, understood, and empowered to move forward. Coming to Him can be as simple as taking a moment of quiet, casting aside worries, and trusting in surrender. This rest is the haven every soul seeks. As St. Augustine profoundly reflected, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." This invitation remains a warm, open embrace, awaiting anyone feeling weary on their journey to find support and healing. From this warm invitation, we realize that Jesus' words are more than just temporary comfort. They are a gateway to profound life philosophies. These are truths that have the power to soothe the soul, release invisible chains, and guide us on the path to true peace. Each philosophy is like a torch illuminating the hidden corners of weariness, showing us the way to lay down our burdens at the feet of God. A journey towards rest begins by acknowledging our burdens. We cannot seek help while pretending that we are fine. The first step to serenity is bravely facing and admitting, "Yes, I am tired. I am carrying a burden." This acknowledgement isn't weakness, but the start of wisdom and the first act of humility. One evening, Jesus saw Jacob, a potter, sitting listlessly by his broken pottery. He approached him and asked, "Jacob, why do you look so troubled?" Jacob sighed, trying to smile. "Teacher, I'm okay, just a less than ideal workday." Jesus looked at his calloused hands and heavy eyes. He gently said, "Your hands say that you have labored, but your eyes say that you bear a worry heavier than that clay. Don't be afraid to speak of your weariness. Only when you recognize the burden on your shoulders can I help you lift it." Jacob burst into tears. He confessed his fear of not being able to provide for his family. The moment he spoke the truth, the burden in his heart began to lighten. Secondly, peace is a journey, not a passive destination. The phrase "come to me" implies action. It demands a shift, a step of faith. Peace doesn't simply fall upon us. It is the result of our decision to walk the path towards the source of peace, even if each step is hesitant and fearful. On the dusty road to Jericho, a woman named Leah followed the crowd, listening to Jesus teach for many days. She carried a silent sorrow. The apostle Andrew noticed and said to Jesus, "Teacher, that woman quietly follows us. She asks for nothing." Jesus turned and looked at Leah with loving eyes. He said loudly, so she could hear, "My child, your journey is a prayer. Your walking in my path shows your desire for rest. You don't need to reach the destination to find peace. Every step you take in faith towards me is part of that rest." Leah looked up, and, for the first time in years, she felt hope. Third, the biggest burdens are often invisible. Physical labor may end when night falls, but the burdens of the soul, anxiety, guilt, pride, fear, follow us into our sleep. These are the most devastating burdens and the ones that God wants to take from us most. Jesus and the apostles passed through a marketplace. They saw a laborer, soaked in sweat, struggling to carry a large sack of rice. Not far away was a tax collector named Matthew, sitting in his booth, looking sullen, even though he wasn't doing any heavy work. The Apostle Peter said, "Teacher, that laborer looks weary." Jesus replied, "Peter, that sack of rice will be set down when he gets home. But look at Matthew. The burden of scorn from others, the burden of insecurity in his heart, and the burden of unclean money are many times heavier than that sack. I came to take away those invisible burdens." Shortly after, he called Matthew to follow him. Fourth, true rest is being strengthened, not escaping. "I will give you rest" does not mean that life will be without challenges. It means that in the storm, we find a haven to regain strength, to be equipped with a new yoke, the yoke of love and grace, which is lighter and easier, so we can face life more bravely. A fisherman named Simon, before being called Peter, returned after a night of fishing with nothing. His boat was empty. Tired and discouraged, he threw his net to the ground. Jesus came and said, "Come to me, and I will give you rest." Simon replied, "Rest? I have to mend my nets. I have to go out to sea tomorrow. I don't have time to rest." Jesus smiled. "Rest does not mean that you will never have to cast your net again. But when you are with me, your soul will rest. Your nets will still tear. The sea will still sometimes rage, but you will no longer fight it alone. I will give you the strength to mend your nets and the joy to go out to sea again." That is true rest. Fifth, sharing burdens is the beginning of healing. The invitation to come to Him is an invitation into a relationship. When we open our hearts and share our deepest burdens with a trustworthy being, the healing process begins. Loneliness multiplies burdens, while sharing diminishes them. A Roman soldier whose daughter was seriously ill stood from a distance, watching Jesus, his heart filled with burdens, but afraid to approach because of fear and stigma. Finally, his concern for his daughter overcame his fear. He came and knelt down, saying, "Lord, I am not worthy, but please just say the word." Jesus helped him up and said, "Soldier, from the moment you decided to share your burden with me, your faith began the journey of healing." Burdens, when spoken, no longer have the power to suffocate the soul. Go home, your daughter is saved. Sixth, humility is the key to opening the door to peace. Only those who recognize their helplessness can reach out for help. Those who are wise in the ways of the world, those who arrogantly believe they can handle everything themselves, will never come. They will forever carry their burdens. Humility is the key to opening the door to God's rest. A learned law teacher came to question Jesus about how to attain eternal life. He asked not to learn, but to test. Jesus answered him with the law. Later, a sinful woman, without saying a word, simply came and washed his feet with her tears. Jesus said to the apostles, "That wise man came with the burden of pride, so he left with that same burden. But this woman came with the burden of sin and a broken, humble heart. Therefore, she left with peace and forgiveness." The door to my rest is always open to humble hearts. Seventh, the source of true peace comes from within, independent of circumstances. God doesn't promise to change external circumstances, but He promises to give peace from within, a peace that the world cannot give and cannot take away. This rest is a state of the soul, not the absence of problems. When the boat encountered a great storm on the Sea of Galilee, the apostles panicked and screamed, the burden of fear crushing them. Meanwhile, Jesus was sleeping soundly at the back of the boat. They woke him up. "Teacher, we are going to die?" He stood up and calmed the storm. But before that, he asked them, "Why are you afraid? Where is your faith?" He wanted to teach them that external storms cannot disturb the peace within if they are with him. The rest he gives is steadfastness, even when surrounded by storms. Eighth, the path to serenity is often surprisingly simple. People tend to complicate things. We think that to be at peace, we must perform elaborate rituals or achieve something significant. But Jesus' invitation is very simple. Come. It requires nothing more than a willing heart. A woman named Mary and her sister Martha welcomed Jesus into their home. Martha was bustling, anxiously preparing everything, with the burden of perfection weighing her down. Mary simply sat at Jesus' feet and listened to his words. Martha complained, "Lord, tell my sister to help me." Jesus replied, "Martha, you are worried about many things, but only one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen the better part." The path to rest is sometimes not about doing more, but about knowing when to stop and be present. Ninth, the invitation to rest isn't for a select few. It's universal. Jesus said, "All who are weary, without exception, no matter who you are, where you come from, what your past is, what your burden is. Tax collectors, sinners, foreigners, the rich, the poor. This invitation is for you. No burden is too great, no soul too estranged to come." By a well in Samaria, Jesus started a conversation with a woman rejected by society because of her personal life. The apostles were surprised to see him talking to someone like that. Jesus spoke to her about living water. He not only gave her water to quench her physical thirst, but he also showed her the burdens of shame and loneliness she was carrying. He told the apostles afterward, "I came not only for the lost sheep of Israel. I came for all who are thirsty and weary, wherever they may be." My heart has enough room for all the burdens of humanity. 10th, surrender is the final act to completely cast off burdens. Acknowledgement and sharing are important steps, but the final and most decisive step to find complete rest is surrender, completely trusting and giving your burdens to God, without trying to take them back. It is the act of letting go of control and believing that He can carry it better than we can. Before being arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus himself experienced the ultimate burden. He prayed, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." The Apostle John, who witnessed that moment, later understood. He told the believers, "That night, the teacher showed us the ultimate lesson about rest. When faced with the greatest burden, he didn't try to endure it alone. He came to the Father, and his final act was surrender. That is how a soul, no matter how wounded, can find the peace to fulfill its mission." Before we continue our exploration today, we encourage you to take a moment to leave a comment and share your feelings. If the content brings positive value, don't forget to click the share button to spread these positive things to friends and family. Let's continue the program. The yoke of Christ is love, not law. When he says, "Take my yoke upon you," Christ is not adding another burden. The yoke of the world is dry law, judgment, the burden of having to prove yourself. But the yoke of Christ is made of love and lined with grace. It is not a burden, but a tool to help us go in the right direction, a connection that helps us walk with him, sharing his strength. A young Levi, who had lived his whole life with hundreds of laws, came to Jesus. He was tired of always fearing to make a mistake. He asked, "Teacher, how can I please God completely?" Jesus looked at him without quoting the law. He simply said, "Do you love the beggar on the corner? Do you share your meal with the hungry widow? Don't try to carry the heavy yoke of every law. Take my yoke, it is the yoke of love. When you love, you will no longer feel the burden of having to do, but only feel the joy of being able to do." True rest is the stillness of the mind. The burden is not only in physical work, but mostly in the nonstop thoughts, the worries swirling in the head. The rest that God offers is a sacred silence, the ability to calm our noisy minds, find a quiet peace even in the storms of life. The Apostle Thomas was a thinker and worrier. One day, when the group was resting under a tree, he was still walking around, looking pensive. Jesus called to him, "Thomas, come sit with me." Thomas sat down, but was still uneasy. He said, "Teacher, I'm worried about the upcoming trip, about the dangers, about what we'll eat and where we'll stay." Jesus put his hand on his shoulder and said, "You are trying to carry the entire future into one moment. Look at those birds, they don't worry. Look at this lily, it doesn't plan. Your mind is like a rippled lake, unable to reflect the sky. Let me calm that lake. My rest begins with the stillness in your mind. Peace is being freed from the burden of the past. So many of us are chained by the mistakes, the regrets of yesterday. We carry them like a shadow, and it makes us tired. Coming to me also means bringing our past and believing that He has the power to erase the burden of sin and heal the wounds of the heart, giving us a fresh start. A woman caught in adultery was brought before Jesus. Her burden was not only the stones people were about to throw, but also the burden of shame and guilt. After dismissing the crowd, Jesus was alone with her. She didn't dare look up. Jesus gently said, "I don't judge you. Let it go. I came not to remind you of sin, but to let you forget its power. Go and sin no more. You are free from your past already." Rest is to stop worrying about tomorrow and trusting in providence. Worrying about the future is one of the most common and useless burdens. It exhausts us with things that haven't happened and may never happen. God's rest is an invitation. Trust in the care of a Father in heaven, one who knows what we need before we even ask. A farmer named Barnabas had a bumper crop, but instead of rejoicing, he worried. He said to Jesus, "Teacher, what should I do? My barns aren't big enough to hold it all. I fear theft. I fear crop damage." Jesus replied, "Barnabas, you're trying to carry the whole year on your shoulders today. You hoard earthly treasures, but you let your soul hunger for peace. Be grateful for today, share with those in need, and entrust tomorrow to God." Rest is not in a full barn, but in a trusting heart. Rest is found in the present moment. We are tired because our minds are not still. It's either dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. We rarely truly live in the present moment. The invitation of Christ is a call to return to reality, for it is only here and now that we can meet Him and receive peace. Jesus and the disciples were walking on a country road. The disciples were hotly debating about who would be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, their minds in a distant future. Jesus stopped. He pointed to a wildflower by the side of the road and said, "Look at it. This flower does not dream of blooming more brightly tomorrow. It is not sad that yesterday it was just a bud. It is fully living its beauty in this moment. You are the same. You are tired from future debates, and you forgot about the presence of me right here. Come to me at this moment. The rest is right here." Burdens vanish when we realize that our value does not come from what we do. The world teaches us that a person's value is measured by achievements, status, and wealth. Having to constantly prove yourself is a terrible burden. Jesus came to say that our value is absolute because we are the beloved children of God. Rest comes when we stop working to be loved and start living because we are loved. A tax collector named Zacchaeus, who was rich, but they were despised by everyone. He climbed a sycamore tree to see Jesus. He carried the weight of isolation and guilt. When Jesus called him by name and wanted to come to his house, Zacchaeus was utterly astonished. At his house, Jesus didn't talk about money or sin. He simply was present. It was that unconditional acceptance that lifted Zacchaeus' burden. He stood up and said, "Lord, I will give half of my possessions to the poor." Jesus smiled and said to everyone, "He is not doing this to buy salvation. He is doing this because he has realized that his value is not in wealth, and a soul at rest always wants to share." The fatigue that comes from comparison. Rest comes from gratitude. One of the origins of soul weariness is the habit of comparing yourself to others. Comparing talent, wealth, or holiness. This always leads to arrogance or guilt. The way out of this burden is to practice gratitude, focusing on what you have been given instead of what you lack. During a meal, the apostles began to compare themselves with one another. Peter boasted about being the first to profess faith. John whispered about being the beloved disciple. They became tense. Jesus took a loaf of bread, broke it, and gave thanks. He said that this loaf does not compare itself to larger loaves. It simply offers itself in gratitude. You are weary because you are looking at each other. Look to the Father and give thanks for what each of you has received. When gratitude is overflowing, there will be no room for comparison. Forgiving others is also removing a burden from your soul. To carry resentment and to hate someone is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. The burden of unforgiveness weighs heavily on our souls and makes us weary. God's invitation is also an invitation to forgive, to free not only others, but also ourselves. Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister?" "Up to 7 times." He thought that 7 times was already a very generous number. Jesus replied, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times." He told him the parable of the unmerciful servant, who was forgiven a huge debt by the king, but did not forgive his friend a small debt. He concluded, "Peter, every time you refuse to forgive, you are tying a stone to your own leg. That burden will drag you down. Come to me and learn to forgive as your Father in heaven has forgiven you. Take off that burden, and you will see how light your soul becomes." Amidst the clamor of the world, rest is learning to listen. The world is full of voices, the voice of ambition, of fear, of public opinion, of judgment. We are weary from trying to listen to them all. The rest that God gives is an inner silence where we can hear His still, small voice, gentle and full of love. The only voice that truly matters. The prophet Elijah of old did not find God in the wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a gentle whisper, following that example. One day, when the noisy crowd surrounded him demanding miracles, Jesus went up to the mountain alone to pray. When he returned, the apostles asked him what he had been doing. Jesus answered, "I went to find rest. Not rest for my body, but so that my soul could hear the voice of my Father amidst the myriad voices of the world." You too, find a quiet place regularly. Come to me in silence. There, you will hear what you need to hear, and your souls will find rest. Rest is not only for recovery, but it is also a teacher. When we stop, when we rest in God, it is not an empty state. It is in those quiet moments that we receive enlightenment, new understandings of ourselves, of God, and of the road ahead. Rest is a classroom for the soul. After the disciples returned from their first missionary journey, they joyfully recounted everything they had done. They were very excited but also exhausted. Jesus said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a while." In that quietness, he did not let them fall asleep. He began to explain to them the deeper things about the kingdom of heaven. The Apostle Matthew later realized that we thought at the time that he was only giving us physical rest. But in reality, he was giving our minds a rest from the excitement of success so that we could receive wiser lessons. His rest always came with revelation. Life has a natural rhythm between labor and rest. God created the universe in 6 days and rested on the 7th day. He established a sacred rhythm. People become weary when they break this rhythm, when they throw themselves into work without stopping, disregarding the need for rest for both body and soul. Come to me is also an invitation. Return to the wise rhythm of creation. A carpenter named Joseph in Nazareth always overworked himself. He worked all 7 days of the week, fearing that if he took a day off, his family would be in need. He became irritable and exhausted. Jesus, as a young man working alongside his foster father, said to him, "Father, this saw, if used continuously without sharpening, will become useless. Land, if cultivated continuously without rest, will become barren." So it is with you. The day of rest is not a day lost, but a day to sharpen the soul and body. God rested not because he was tired, but to teach us about the wisdom of rhythm. We find rest not only alone, but also in fellowship. The invitation to come to him is not only a personal invitation. It is also an invitation to the community, to his body. When we share our burdens with our brothers and sisters in faith, when we pray together and support each other, each person's burden seems much lighter. 2 disciples were on the road to Emmaus. Their hearts were heavy because their teacher had just been crucified. They carried the burden of disappointment and brokenness. Jesus appeared and walked with them. They did not recognize him, but as they shared their sorrows, their hearts began to warm up. When they invited him to stay and break bread with them, their eyes were opened. The lesson here is that when 2 or 3 people share a burden together and share it in the name of God, he will be present in their midst. Rest is multiplied when it is shared in community. The burden of perfection is unbearable. Rest lies in grace. Many of us, especially those who are passionate, often place the burden of perfection on our own shoulders. We want to be the perfect child, the perfect father, the perfect mother, the perfect believer. This effort inevitably leads to exhaustion and disappointment. Rest is accepting that we are not perfect, but that we are perfectly loved by a gracious God. Nicodemus, a Jewish leader, came to Jesus at night. He was an exemplary person, perfectly keeping the law, but his soul still had no peace. He carried the burden of having to maintain that perfect image. Jesus told him about being born again, a concept that overturned all his efforts. He implied, "Nicodemus, you cannot achieve perfection on your own. That burden is too great. Put it down. Let the grace of God make you new." Rest is not about achieving perfection, but about letting the perfection of God envelop our imperfection. A great burden is lifted by many small steps in faith. Sometimes our burdens seem too great, like a mountain that cannot be moved. We feel overwhelmed. But the invitation to come does not require us to make an extraordinary leap. It only invites us to take the small step right in front of us, and then the next step. Many small steps in trust will take us through the whole mountain. A father whose child was seriously ill traveled a long distance to find Jesus. When he met him, he was exhausted and almost desperate. He said, "Lord, I don't know what to do anymore. The burden is too much for me." Jesus did not ask him for a great act of faith. He simply said, "Believe." Then he continued, "Now go home." The first step of faith is the plea. The second step is trust. The third step is to obediently go home. It was the journey home, step by step, that strengthened his faith. The burden was lifted not in a moment, but through a series of small acts of obedience. Tears are not weakness, but the language of a soul shedding burdens. Some people think that coming to God means being strong and hiding pain. But in reality, He calls even the brokenhearted. Tears before God are not a sign of a lack of faith, but an act of liberation, a way for the burden of sorrow to flow out, making room for His comfort to enter. When Lazarus, Jesus' friend, died, his sister Mary came to him. She did not say much. She simply knelt at his feet and wept. She had carried the burden of grief for days. When Jesus saw her weeping, He was deeply moved, and He wept with her. He did not tell her not to cry. He accepted and shared that pain. It was in those shared tears that Mary's burden was shared. Rest is sometimes not the absence of tears, but having someone willing to weep with us. The wisdom of God is often foolishness in the eyes of the world. The world honors strength, self-reliance, and tireless labor. The concept of resting in weakness or finding strength in surrender seems strange. But the philosophy of the kingdom of heaven often reverses the philosophy of the world. Coming to God for rest is an act of faith that goes against the human instinct for self-reliance. A Greek scholar, familiar with the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, came to hear Jesus preach. He heard him say, "Come to me, all you who are weary." Later, he said to the apostle Philip, "It's strange, your philosophers teach people to be strong, to use reason to overcome all emotions and burdens. But your teacher invites the weak. Isn't that a philosophy for failures?" Philip replied, "Perhaps it is in the eyes of the world, but we have learned that acknowledging our weakness before God is where true strength begins. The rest that He gives is greater than all human wisdom." Caring for the body is also a spiritual act. Burdens are not only in the soul, but also manifest through the exhaustion of the body. The invitation to rest also implies that we need to respect the limits of the body that God has given us. A good night's sleep, a sufficient meal, a day off from work are also ways to respond to His invitation. After a long day of teaching and healing thousands of people, Jesus and His disciples were weary and hungry. A few disciples still wanted to continue, arguing that the work of the kingdom of heaven could not be delayed. But Jesus said, "Now let's go to the other side and rest a while." He had multiplied bread to feed the people, and He also made sure that His disciples were fed. He taught them that you cannot pour water from an empty pitcher. This body is a temple. Taking care of it is not selfish, but is to keep the temple strong to continue serving. Come, let us eat and rest. Peace in the soul is the true treasure. All other possessions can become burdens. People toil to accumulate wealth, fame, and power, thinking that it is the guarantee of a comfortable life. But Jesus shows that those things often become the greatest burdens, the burden of the fear of loss, of bottomless greed. True rest is an inner treasure that does not depend on what we own. A rich young man came to Jesus and asked how to obtain eternal life. He had kept all the commandments from his youth. He had everything but still felt lacking. His soul still toiled. Jesus looked at him and said, "You still lack one thing. Sell all your possessions and give to the poor, and then come, follow me." This invitation was not just about money. It was an invitation to shed the burden of wealth, the burden of believing that wealth can bring security. The rich young man went away sad because he could not give up his precious burden. He chose to keep the burden instead of the treasure of peace. True rest does not lead to selfishness, but equips us with the strength to serve. Some people mistakenly believe that rest means becoming passive, caring only for oneself. But rest in God has the opposite effect. It fills us with love and strength so that we can serve others more joyfully and effectively, not from depletion, but from abundance. After Jesus had given his disciples rest, healed them, and taught them, he sent them out again. He said, "As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." The Apostle John, in his old age, reflected on this. He wrote, "He invited us to rest, not so that we would remain in that comfort forever. He filled our souls, like pouring oil into a lamp, and then he lit us up and placed us in the world." His rest was preparation for action. The rest we find in the Lord in this life is a glimpse of eternal peace. The peace and tranquility that we feel when we come to the Lord is not the final destination. It is a foretaste, a taste of the complete and eternal rest that God has promised to those who believe in him in the kingdom of heaven. This gives earthly burdens a new meaning and a great hope. At the Last Supper, when the disciples' hearts were heavy because they knew that their teacher was about to leave, Jesus said, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. In my Father's house are many rooms. I am going there to prepare a place for you." He gave them his peace even in the midst of the greatest turmoil. It was not a peace that excluded suffering, but a deeper peace that came from a promise. He meant that the rest you have when you are with me now, however precious, is only a shadow of the glorious rest that awaits you. Burdens in this life are temporary, but rest in the Father is eternal. Take that hope, and your burdens will become light. Before we continue our journey of discovery today, we hope that you will take a moment to leave a comment and share your feelings. If the content brings positive value, don't forget to click the share button to spread these positive things to friends and family. Please continue with Program 31. Rest is freeing oneself from the burden of expectations. We carry not only our own burdens, but also the burdens of the expectations of others. Family, society, friends. We are tired of having to live up to a certain image. Come to me is an invitation. Cast off the masks, the roles, and dare to live as yourself before God, who knows and loves you more than what you try to show. A young man in the crowd following Jesus was the son of a famous Pharisee. He always carried the burden of having to appear wise and righteous like his father. He dared not ask questions. He dared not show weakness. Jesus sensed his distress. He told a parable about two trees, one that was shaped every day to have a perfect form but bore no fruit, and another that grew freely according to the way God created it, and it bore abundant fruit. Then he looked at the young man and said, "You are weary from trying to be a tree in the eyes of others. I am not calling you according to the expectations of your father or of society. I am calling you. Come to me with all your imperfections. True rest is being free to grow according to the way I have created you." The door to rest is widest open to those who have simple, childlike faith. We adults often complicate faith. We analyze, debate, and doubt. Children are different. They trust completely and simply. The invitation of the Lord does not require profound understanding, but a simple trust, like a child taking their father's hand, believing that their father will lead them to a safe place. When the disciples were arguing about complex theological issues, Jesus called a child and placed him in their midst. He said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You are carrying the burden of human wisdom." This child is not worried about the things you are arguing about. He only knows that his parents love him. Come to me with such simple faith. Don't try to understand everything. Just trust in me, and you will find rest. Fatigue blurs judgment. Rest brings clarity. When we are exhausted, every decision becomes difficult. Every problem seems larger than it really is. A tired mind cannot think clearly. Rest in the Lord not only restores energy, but also purifies the mind, helping us see things more clearly and calmly, enabling us to make better decisions. Choose more wisely. A synagogue elder named Jairus, when his daughter was at death's door, ran to Jesus in utter desperation. The weight of his fear nearly drove him mad. Jesus offered him a simple phrase, "Don't be afraid, just believe." It was an invitation to rest in faith right in the thick of the storm. After bringing the child back to life, Jesus didn't rush off. He calmly told the family, "Give her something to eat." This action demonstrated the return of clear thinking once the burden had been lifted. He was teaching that rest restores not only faith, but also the ability to make the most practical judgments. It takes courage to be vulnerable. Rest is for those who dare to be authentic. The world teaches us to hide our weaknesses, to always project strength. Maintaining a flawless facade is incredibly exhausting. Coming to Him requires a different kind of courage. The courage to admit our imperfections, to expose our wounds, to say, "I need help." Rest is reserved for brave souls who live genuinely. The Apostle Peter, after denying Christ 3 times, carried the weight of shame and failure. He couldn't face anyone. He returned to his old trade, trying to forget everything. After the resurrection, Jesus sought him out by the sea. He didn't scold him. He simply asked, 3 times, "Simon, do you love me?" He gave Peter the opportunity to confront his weakness and be true to his love. It was in that honest, painful confrontation that Peter found rest for his soul and was restored to his mission. Nature is a sanctuary of rest. Sometimes, our burdens stem from being confined for too long within concrete walls and human worries. Jesus frequently went up to the mountains, to the seashore, or into the desert. Nature, God's creation, possesses an extraordinary healing power. It reminds us of the grandeur of the Creator and the insignificance of our anxieties. After days in a noisy and stressful Jerusalem, Jesus told his disciples, "Let's go to the fields outside the city." As they sat on a hill overlooking the landscape, he said, "Take a deep breath. This air is a gift. Listen to the wind. It's the breath of God. Look at those mountains. They stand firm through generations. Are your burdens greater than these mountains? Let the stillness of nature seep into your souls." This, too, is a way to come to me and find rest. The greatest burden is the illusion of control. Rest is the act of letting go. We exhaust ourselves trying to control everything in our lives, our careers, our health, the people we love, and even the future. But the truth is, we control very little. This burden arises from the illusion that we're in charge. True rest is the courageous act of relinquishing the steering wheel and trusting in the Almighty, the true captain of our lives. A vineyard owner named Manahem anxiously inspected each vine every day. He controlled the water supply, caught every beetle, and became furious when a strong wind knocked off a few leaves. He never found peace. Jesus passed by and asked, "Sir, who makes the sun rise each morning to warm your vineyard?" Manahem replied, "God does, of course." Jesus then asked, "And who makes the rain fall to water them?" "Also God," he answered. Jesus smiled. "Then why do you try to carry the burden of both the sun and the rain on your shoulders? Do your part and let God do His." Rest lies in that division of labor. Music, the invitation to rest never expires. It's always renewed each morning. Perhaps yesterday we rejected the invitation, or maybe we received rest, but lost it today due to new worries. Burdens are a daily reality. But the good news is that God's invitation is as well. His grace is renewed every morning. Each day is a fresh opportunity to come to Him and cast off the burdens of that day. A woman used to come to the well at midday to avoid people. Every day, she carried the weight of loneliness and judgment. One day, she met Jesus there. He offered her living water and lifted her burden. But the next day, old habits and fears returned. She hesitated, wondering if she should go to the well again. But then she remembered His words. She realized that just as the sun rises again, His invitation was there waiting for her. The spring of living water hadn't dried up after one day. She bravely ventured out and recognized that rest isn't a one-time event, but a daily choice. The world promotes constant striving. The kingdom of heaven offers rest in abundance. The culture around us often glorifies busyness. The busier someone is, the more important they seem. Doing nothing is seen as laziness. This is a burden of our time. Jesus came to introduce an opposite philosophy. Our worth isn't determined by how busy we are, but by how connected we are to Him. Rest is an act of resistance against the culture of exhaustion. Jesus saw a shoemaker working tirelessly in his shop. Even late at night, passers-by praised his diligence. Jesus entered and asked, "Friend, why are you still working?" The shoemaker replied, "I must work to earn a living, to prove my worth." Jesus said, "You already have worth. This chair you're sitting on doesn't need to do anything to be a chair. It already is. You are the same. Come to me and learn about abundance." Rest isn't the enemy of work. It's the companion that ensures your work springs from joy, not fear. Silence is also a prayer when language fails. Sometimes, our burdens are so great that we lack the words to express them. The pain is too deep, the weariness too immense. In those moments, coming to Him doesn't require a hymn or a formal prayer. Sometimes, it's simply about silent presence, bringing our burdened soul and sitting quietly at His feet. That silence is the most eloquent prayer. When He heard that John the Baptist, his brother, had been beheaded, Jesus didn't give a speech or cry out. The Bible says He withdrew to a solitary place. The disciples saw Him just sitting there, silently looking out at the lake, and they didn't dare disturb Him. Later, Andrew asked Him, "What did you pray then?" Jesus replied, "Some burdens are too heavy for words to bear." At that moment, my silence was a prayer offered to the Father. You, too, when you don't know what to say, don't force it. Just come and sit quietly with me. I understand the language of silence. Rest in faith is often the soil where miracles sprout. When we worry, fear, and try to solve everything ourselves, we harden our hearts, leaving no room for God's intervention. When we let go, rest, and trustingly surrender, we soften our hearts, making them receptive. It's in that soil of rest and trust that the seeds of miracles can sprout. The woman afflicted with bleeding for 12 years had spent all her money on doctors, but her condition only worsened. She carried the burden of illness, poverty, and ritual impurity. She was exhausted from striving. One day, she decided to abandon all her efforts. She had only one act of faith left. If I can just touch His cloak, I will be healed. It was an act of complete surrender, a rest from all human remedies. And as soon as she touched it, the miracle happened. Rest from self-reliance opened the way for God's power to act. We will continue with the final 10 philosophies in the next section. Knowledge without love can become a burden. The scribes and Pharisees were the most knowledgeable people about the scriptures. They carried a treasure trove of knowledge, but for many of them, that knowledge had become a burden of arrogance, a tool for judging others rather than a source of compassion. True rest comes when the knowledge of the head is warmed by the love of the heart. A young scribe came to debate with Jesus, flawlessly quoting prophecies and laws. He spoke a great deal, but his face was tense. Jesus patiently listened, then asked him a question. Of all those laws, which is the most important? After he correctly answered about loving God and loving neighbor, Jesus said, "You answer very well, but you're carrying those teachings like a block of ice on your back. You know a lot about love, but have you lived it? Come to me and learn how to turn those stones of knowledge into bread to feed others." Rest isn't in how much you know, but in how much you love. There is no pillow as soft as a clear conscience. One of the burdens that keeps us awake most often is a guilty conscience. Unforgiven mistakes, unconfessed lies, hidden injustices. They weigh heavily on our souls. The invitation to come to me is also an invitation to truth, to repentance and reconciliation, to rediscover the peace of a clear conscience. After betraying Christ, Judas carried the burden of 30 pieces of silver. That silver burned his conscience. He tried to unload that burden in the wrong way, returning it to the priests, who couldn't offer forgiveness. In contrast, Peter, after denying Christ, wept bitterly. He brought his burden to Christ himself in repentance. After the resurrection, Jesus didn't mention Peter's sin. He only gave him a new mission: take care of my sheep. He cleansed Peter's conscience, granting him the most precious rest so that he could continue his journey. Burdens become lighter when we see God's bigger picture. We become weary because we see only a small fragment of our lives. We are trapped in the details of the immediate difficulty, like an ant lost in a crack in the pavement. Coming to me is an invitation to climb to a higher vantage point to see God's perspective, where our winding roads are actually part of a grand and beautiful plan. When John the Baptist was in prison, he began to doubt. He carried the burden of confusion. He sent his disciples to ask Jesus if he was truly the one who was to come. Jesus didn't answer yes or no. He said, "Go back and tell John what you see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk." He was inviting John to look at the bigger picture, to look at the signs of the kingdom of heaven arriving, instead of focusing only on the burden of the four walls of his prison. When you see God's work is still ongoing, the burden of doubt is lifted. The body remembers burdens that the mind wants to forget. There are injuries, fears so deep that our minds bury them. But the body doesn't forget. They manifest as unexplained aches, stiffness, chronic fatigue. The rest that God offers is a holistic healing, reaching even the painful memories that the body is carrying, freeing us from the burdens of which we are not even aware. A woman who had been crippled for 18 years came to the synagogue, carrying her burden visibly. That illness not only bent her body, but also weighed heavily on her spirit. Jesus called her over. He didn't just speak a word. He laid his hands on her. There was physical contact, a recognition that this burden had been remembered for too long by her body. When he said that she was freed from her infirmity, not only was her back straightened, but an 18-year burden in her soul and the memory of her body was also lifted. God's burden doesn't take away strength, but gives purpose. Jesus said, "My yoke is easy, and my burden is light." This is a paradox. How can a yoke, a burden, be light? Because the burdens of the world, ambition, fear, drain our energy. But God's burden is the burden of love, of mission, of purpose, which gives us energy. Living with purpose makes all labor meaningful and lighter. When the disciples were fishermen, they toiled for their daily bread. That was a burden. But when Jesus called them and said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men," he placed a new burden on their shoulders. This burden required them to give up everything, to face danger. But strangely, they seemed full of life because now every step they took had a purpose. Their labor was no longer meaningless. Peter later said that he'd rather be tired from preaching the good news than tired from hauling in empty nets. Rest is being freed from the prison of human fear. One of the biggest prisons we put ourselves in is the fear of what others think. This burden controls our actions, our words, and even our dreams. We don't dare do what is right for fear of criticism. We don't dare be ourselves for fear of rejection. Coming to me is receiving the only approval that matters, God's approval, and from that, being set free. Many Jewish leaders believed in Jesus, but the Bible says that they didn't dare confess it publicly because they loved the glory of men more than the glory of God. They chose to stay in the prison of that burden. In contrast, Jesus faced them and spoke the truth without fear because he wasn't seeking their approval. He told his disciples, "Do not fear those who can only kill the body." He was inviting them out of the prison of fear to the freedom and rest of someone who lives only to please God. True rest isn't doing nothing but waiting in faith. In a world that constantly demands action and immediate results, waiting is seen as a waste of time. But in the spiritual life, waiting is an incredibly active action. It's an act of rest, a refusal to act in panic and instead trusting in God's perfect timing. Lazarus's family sent word to Jesus when he became ill, but he didn't come right away. He waited. For Mary and Martha, that waiting was a burden of misunderstanding and grief. When Jesus arrived, Martha said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus showed that his waiting wasn't indifference, but so that a greater glory could be revealed. He teaches us that resting while waiting, though difficult, is an act of deep faith, believing that God's delay isn't his denial. The weariness of living aimlessly is heavier than laboring for a noble cause. Before meeting Christ, many of us live lives without clear direction. We wander from pleasure to goal, and the emptiness creates a special type of fatigue, a burden of meaninglessness. Taking up God's yoke, even though it demands sacrifice, removes the burden of uncertainty because it gives our lives direction and ultimate meaning. The Samaritan woman at the well had had 5 husbands, and the man she was living with wasn't her husband. She was weary of a life spent seeking love and satisfaction in one place after another. That was the burden of aimlessness. Jesus offered her living water, a purpose, a relationship that filled that emptiness. Immediately, she left her water jar, a symbol of her old needs, and ran into the city to testify about him. She was no longer weary. She had found a new labor, but it was the joyous labor of someone who had found purpose. A soul resting in God is like a pool of cool water. People who carry burdens tend to transmit their stress and fatigue to others. In contrast, someone who has truly found rest in God radiates an atmosphere of peace. Their presence can soothe the agitated souls around them, like a calm and cool pool of water on a hot summer day. At the Last Supper, when the disciples were confused, afraid, and arguing, Jesus, even though he was about to face the greatest burden, was the most at peace in the room. He was the eye of the storm. He knelt down and washed their feet. The action of someone completely at rest in the will of the Father brought peace and astonishment to the entire room. He said, "My peace I give you." He didn't just say it. He transmitted that peace through his very presence and actions. Someone who has truly rested becomes a source of rest for others. All rest in this life is a preparation for the final reunion. All the moments of peace, the times of casting off burdens, the healings that we experience here, though real and precious, are still just shadows, foretastes of the great and ultimate rest. The invitation to come to me is not just for today, but an invitation for a journey toward our eternal home, where every tear will be wiped away and every burden will vanish forever. Always. On the cross, right before his last breath, Jesus uttered those words. "It is finished." These were the words of someone who had taken on the greatest burden of all humanity and had completed his work. And then he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." This was the ultimate act of rest, a complete return. His invitation to us is ultimately the same. He invites us to come to him each day to practice surrender, to taste peace ahead of time, and to prepare for the day when we too can say, "It is finished," and enter into eternal rest in his loving arms. Before we continue our journey of discovery today, please take a moment to leave a comment and share your feelings. If the content brings positive value, don't forget to click the share button to spread these positive things to friends and family. Now, let's continue with program 51. Rest does not only come from receiving. It is also found in the joy of giving. This is a paradox of the kingdom of heaven. We often think that we are tired because we have given too much and need to receive something in return. But sometimes, exhaustion comes from focusing too much on ourselves and our own needs. Generously giving, without calculation, a smile, a word of encouragement, a meal, can fill our souls with unexpected energy and joy. That, too, is a form of deep rest. In the temple, Jesus watched the rich putting a lot of money into the offering box. They did it heavily, as if it were an obligation. Then a poor widow came and put in 2 small coins, all she had. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "Those rich people gave from their surplus, and their burden remains. But this widow, in giving everything, has found freedom. When you give from your need with a trusting heart, you will receive back not wealth, but rest for your souls. Because then you are acting most like your Father in heaven." The burden of the age is incessant noise. Rest is finding an oasis of silence in your soul. The noise comes not only from the outside, the pounding, the crowds, but also from within us, the voice of anxiety, of judgment, of incessant desires. We are tired because we do not have a moment of quiet. "Come to me" is an invitation. Have the courage to turn off those sounds to discover that right in your soul there is a quiet hiding place, where only the presence of God exists. A weaver named Samuel lived near the noisy market. He complained to Jesus, "Teacher, how can I find peace in this noisy place?" Jesus replied, "The outside may be noisy, but the greatest noise is in your heart. You do not need to move to find quiet. You only need to find the quiet room right in your heart. Try to spend a few minutes each day, closing your eyes and doing nothing but listening to your breath. Little by little you will discover an oasis of silence that no noise of the world can touch. That is where I am waiting for you." The burden of loneliness is taken away when we realize we belong to a larger family. Loneliness is one of the most painful and coldest burdens. The feeling of not belonging anywhere, of not having anyone who truly understands you, is exhausting. When Jesus invites, "Come to me," he is not only inviting us into a private relationship, but also inviting us to join a family, the family of all those who are also seeking rest in him. When someone told Jesus that his mother and brothers were outside looking for him, he did not rush out. Instead, he looked at those sitting around him, the fishermen, the tax collectors, the women, the sinners, and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, that person is my brother, sister, and mother." He is teaching that when we come to him, we will never be alone again. We belong to a new family, a family that is linked not by blood but by love and faith, where we can share and bear each other's burdens. Rest is not an emotion we wait for, but a decision we choose by faith. We often say, "When I feel at peace, I will rest." But faith works the other way around. We must decide to rest first, decide to trust and surrender first, even when the heart is still in turmoil. And then the feeling of peace will come later as a result of that choice. When the disciples were on the boat caught in the storm, they were terrified. They waited for the storm to subside to feel safe. But Jesus, after calming the sea, did not say, "Now you can feel at peace." He asked, "Where is your faith?" He wanted them to understand that faith is choosing to trust in his presence even when the waves are still crashing against the boat, deciding to trust in him. That is the act of resting. The calmness of the sea is just an affirmation of that decision. The burden of self-reliance is one of the proudest and most tiring burdens. Our culture often praises self-made people, those who do not need to rely on anyone. But having to constantly prove that you are capable, good enough, and strong enough to get through everything on your own is a burden of pride. It prevents us from receiving help from both God and people. "Come to me" is an invitation to give up the burden of self-reliance and embrace rest and mutual support. The Apostle Paul later recounted his experience. He had a thorn in his flesh that caused him pain. He tried to endure it on his own and asked God to take it away 3 times. But God answered him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul learned a valuable lesson. He said, "Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities." He gave up the burden of self-reliance and discovered that it was in accepting dependence on God's grace that he found extraordinary strength and rest. Rest is knowing how to stop and give thanks for the journey so far. We are often tired because our eyes are always looking forward, at the next mountain to climb, at the next problem to solve. We forget that we have come a long way. Taking time to look back and give thanks for what God has done, for the difficulties overcome, for the blessings received, is a way to recharge the soul and find rest in gratitude. In the story of the 10 lepers who were healed, all 10 received the miracle, but only one returned. He came and fell at Jesus' feet, loudly giving thanks. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9?" Then he said to the one who had returned, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." The other 9 received only physical healing. But this one, because he knew how to stop to give thanks, received both rest and salvation for his soul. Exhaustion happens when we try to live by our own strength. Rest happens when we learn to breathe in the atmosphere of grace. Grace is not just initial forgiveness. It is the atmosphere that Christians are invited to live in every day. When we forget that and start trying to live well and live morally by our own efforts, we will quickly become exhausted. This is like someone trying to run while holding their breath. "Come to me" is a reminder to take a deep breath. Live by the energy of grace, not by personal will. Jesus told the parable of the prodigal son. When the son returned, the older brother was working in the field. He was angry that his father was throwing a party for a prodigal brother. The older brother said to his father, "Look, all these years I have been serving you, not disobeying any order." He was tired. He was living by his own strength, by effort and merit. He did not know how to breathe in the atmosphere of love and grace in his father's house. Rest, the party, the joy were all there. But he had excluded himself because of the burden of self-righteousness. The burden of wanting to fix everyone will crush you. Many well-intentioned people often take on the burden of a savior. They want to fix their partner, their children, their friends. They jump in to give advice, try to control other people's behavior, and then become tired and frustrated when things don't change. Rest is when we humbly realize that there is only one Savior, and that our role is to love and pray, not to change others. Mary and Martha both loved their brother Lazarus. When he was sick, they did everything they could. They tried to fix the situation, but in the end, they were helpless. Their burden peaked when Lazarus died. When Jesus came, they could only say, "Lord, if you had been here." That was an admission of their helplessness. And it was at that point that Jesus, the true healer, acted. He teaches us that rest comes when we hand over our burden of fixing to Him and trust in His power. Rest is hidden in the ordinary, everyday tasks. We often look for rest in faraway places, a vacation, a pilgrimage, a retreat. Those things are good, but God also invites us to find rest right in everyday life. Washing a dish, sweeping a yard, or sewing a shirt, if done with a present and peaceful heart, can also become an act of meditation and an opportunity to connect with God. Jesus lived 30 years in Nazareth, working as an ordinary carpenter. He did not begin his mission with great miracles, but with faithfulness in small things. He found rest and connection with his Father not only on the mountaintop, but also beside the workbench, in the scent of wood, in the precision of a cut. He teaches us that the soul can rest even when the hands are working, meaning that our heart is in the right place, in the presence of God. The wisdom of rest sometimes lies in the ability to say no. We are tired because we say yes to too many things, too many requests, too many activities, too many ambitions. We are afraid of disappointing others, afraid of missing opportunities. The burden of being overwhelmed is created by ourselves. Learning to say no to good things so that you can say yes to the best things, like peace, time for family, time for God, is an important spiritual discipline to find rest. Martha was a kind and hospitable woman. When Jesus came to her house, she said yes to preparing a sumptuous meal. But she also said yes to worry, comparison, and busyness. Jesus gently showed her the wisdom of saying no. He said, "Only one thing is necessary." This implies that Martha could have said no to a few elaborate dishes so that she could say yes to sitting at his feet. Rest requires us to have discernment and courage to set healthy boundaries. Resentment is a burden you carry yourself. Holding a grudge against someone is like carrying a hot stone on your back everywhere you go. It burns you. not the other person. This burden is entirely self-imposed. Forgiveness, though very difficult, is an act of will to put that stone down, not because the other person deserves it, but because you deserve rest and freedom. Jesus told the parable of the two sons. The prodigal son had made mistakes, but he was able to cast off the burden of guilt when he returned. The older brother, on the other hand, picked up a new burden himself, the burden of resentment and unforgiveness. He stood outside the party, torturing himself with thoughts of injustice. The father came out and invited him. "Son, come on in here." That is also God's invitation to us. Come on in here. Cast off the burden of resentment and enter into the joy of forgiveness. Do not choose exhaustion for yourself. Rest is not just silence, but also laughter and joy. We often associate rest with solemnity and quietness. But an important part of the rest that God gives is the ability to play innocently like a child. A hearty laugh, a joyful dance, a playful game are great ways to shed the burden of seriousness and worry. Rejoicing in the Lord is our strength. Jesus was criticized by the Pharisees for being a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. This shows that he did not always keep a solemn face. He attended weddings and meals. He laughed with those who were rejected by society. He turned water into fine wine at the wedding at Cana, not because it was an essential need, but to contribute to the joy of the party. He teaches us that rest can also be found in allowing ourselves to have fun, to enjoy the good gifts of life without feeling guilty. The burden of the age is a flood of information. Rest is daring to disconnect. Whether in ancient or modern times, people have always been surrounded by information, opinions, rumors, teachings. The burden of having to process everything, of having to have an opinion on everything, is exhausting. Rest is the intentional act of withdrawing from that flood of information so that you can clearly hear the one voice that truly nourishes the soul, the voice of God. After hearing the news of the death of John the Baptist and the disciples returning from their missionary journey, there was a lot of information and mixed emotions. The crowds continued to flock in. In that context, Jesus made a decisive decision. He said to the disciples, "Come away by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while." He actively disconnected from the crowd and their demands. He teaches that to truly connect with God and with yourself, sometimes we must dare to disconnect from the outside world. A resting posture of the body can invite peace to the soul. The soul and the body are not two separate entities. An anxious soul often leads to a tense body, shoulders hunched, fists clenched, teeth grinding. Conversely, we can use the body to invite rest for the soul. A simple act like taking a deep breath, relaxing the shoulders, or opening the palms can be a physical signal to the soul that it is safe. Rest now. When the disciples were panicking on the boat because of the storm, their posture was certainly one of tension and contraction. Jesus, on the other hand, was sleeping. The sleeping posture is the posture of complete surrender and trust. His action not only showed peace in the soul, but also showed a completely resting body. When he got up, he did not act in haste. He stood firm. He teaches us to pay attention to our bodies. Learn to release it as an act of faith, and the soul will follow. Envy is a burden that makes the soul toxic. Envy is the evil twin of comparison. When we see others being blessed, instead of rejoicing, we feel bitterness and discomfort. This burden silently poisons all joy and makes our souls ugly. True rest is learning to celebrate the success of others and believing that God has a good and unique plan for each person. In the parable of the vineyard workers, those who worked from early morning were jealous of those who worked only the last hour of the day and still received the same wage. The burden of envy robbed them of the joy of working and being paid. They became bitter. The owner of the vineyard, the image of God, said, "Are you envious because I am generous?" He teaches that God's generosity is not for comparison. Rest comes when we stop looking at the rewards of others and start enjoying the goodness of God for ourselves. Sadness that is not expressed becomes a silent burden. Society often encourages us to be strong, to overcome sadness quickly. But sadness that is not allowed to be expressed, not acknowledged, will not disappear. It will settle down and become a heavy, silent stone in the heart, affecting every aspect of life. Come to me is an invitation. Come and find a safe place to be allowed to be sad, to be allowed to mourn. Music. When Lazarus died, Martha went out to meet Jesus with words of faith and theology. But Mary was different. She came and fell at his feet and just wept. She did not try to hide the burden of sorrow, and Jesus' response was special. The Bible records that he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. He entered into her sadness. He legitimized that pain. Rest is not always joy. Sometimes it is permission to grieve fully in the presence of one who understands. Rest is trusting in the potter, even when we are still a lump of clay. We are tired because we want to see the final product immediately. We want to know what life. How will I turn out? How will this hardship end? The burden of impatience and wanting to see the future torments us. Rest is trusting in the process, believing that the master potter knows what he's doing with our lives, even when we only feel like we're being spun around, pressed down, and without any shape at all. The disciples frequently worried about their position in the kingdom of heaven. They wanted to know what the final product would look like. But Jesus often spoke of parables of process, a mustard seed growing from tiny to large, yeast causing the dough to rise. He wanted to teach them to trust in the unseen process of growth. Come to me, he said, and let me mold you. Don't worry about the final shape of the vase. Just simply be a soft lump of clay in my hands. Rest lies in that softness and surrender. Deceit is a burden that must constantly be added to. One small lie requires another lie to cover it up, and then another. Gradually, we have to carry the burden of a complex web of deceit, always fearing discovery. It exhausts us. Living in the truth, though initially difficult or embarrassing, is ultimately incredibly freeing. Truth carries its own lightness. Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts tried to carry the burden of deceit. They wanted the reputation of generosity without paying the price. The burden of having to appear better than they really were led to a tragic end. Conversely, the Samaritan woman, when confronted by Jesus, initially lied, "I have no husband." But when Jesus exposed her truth in love, she no longer ran from it. She lived in that truth and was liberated. She left her water jar, a symbol of her old life, and ran to proclaim the truth. Rest comes when we stop pretending. Bearing the burdens of others in prayer is not carrying them alone. When we love someone, we often feel their burdens as our own. This can exhaust us. But praying for them doesn't mean we have to carry their pain ourselves. Prayer is the act of bringing both the person and their burden to and placing them at the feet of God. It is an act of communion, sharing the burden with the only one who can truly bear it. Jesus frequently prayed for his disciples. Before Peter denied him, he said, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail." Jesus didn't prevent Peter's trial, nor did he take on Peter's fear. He carried Peter in his prayer to the Father. He teaches us that the best way to help someone who is carrying a burden is to become a conduit for that burden to God, not a final destination where the burden comes to rest. Ultimately, rest is not a concept, but a person. After analyzing 69 philosophies, the most important and simplest truth lies in the original invitation. Come to me. Rest isn't found in a system, a technique, a religion, or a set of rules. It's found in a living, breathing relationship with a person, Jesus Christ. All the philosophies are just different paths leading back to the same destination, his arms. John's act at the Last Supper was incredibly simple, but fully expressed this philosophy. In the midst of everyone's anxiety and fear, he leaned his head on Jesus' chest. He didn't ask a theological question. He didn't try to find a solution. He simply sought closeness with the very person of his teacher. That act is the summation of everything. The burdens of the world may still be there, but when we are in his close presence, resting our head on his chest, we will find rest that no words can fully describe. That is the final destination of every weary soul. Before we continue our journey of discovery today, please take a moment to leave a comment and share your feelings. If the content has provided positive value, don't forget to click the share button to spread these positive things to friends and family. We invite you to continue the program. The burden of unseen scars. There are wounds that don't bleed, but ache persistently. A cruel word from childhood, a betrayal, a loss not fully mourned. We carry these invisible scars like a heavy coat of armor. Come to me is an invitation to let the great physician gently touch those scars, not to make them hurt again, but to transform them from places of pain into places of empathy and strength. A retired Roman soldier who had witnessed and caused much violence often had nightmares. He carried the burden of what he had seen and done. He came to hear Jesus preach, always standing far away. One day, Jesus approached him and pointed to an old scar on the soldier's arm. He asked if the scar still hurt. The soldier was surprised. "No, it's healed," Jesus said. "But there are scars in your soul that still ache. Don't try to hide them. Bring even those scars to me. I won't erase them, but I can turn their pain into wisdom and their shame into compassion." Rest is when your scars stop defining who you are. Rest is escaping the tyranny of the urgent. We are living under an invisible yoke, urgency. Everything has to be fast, immediate. This burden causes us to always be in a hurry, never truly present, and to ignore the things that are truly important, like family, health, and soul, in order to chase after what is urgent. Rest is a small revolution, daring to put the important things above the urgent things. Jia, a messenger, was always rushing. He ran from place to place, delivering news to everyone. He was proud of his speed, but was always exhausted and irritable. He asked Jesus, "How can I work even more efficiently?" Jesus replied, "You don't need to be faster, you need to slow down. You are carrying the burden of urgency. You think that every message is equally important. Learn to distinguish. My Father's invitation is important, but it rarely shouts. It is a still, small voice. Rest, so you can hear what is truly important instead of just chasing after what is clamoring loudly. Rest is being fully understood. One of the deepest forms of weariness is the feeling that no one truly understands you. We try to explain, try to express ourselves, but words seem helpless. The burden of being alone in your thoughts and emotions is heavy. Coming to Jesus is coming to the one who not only hears what we say, but also reads our hearts. Rest comes from the sigh of relief. Finally someone understands. After teaching in parables, the disciples often came to Jesus privately, asking him to explain them. They carried the burden of not understanding. Once, after explaining a complex parable, he looked at them and said, "You are tired of trying to use your minds to grasp things that belong to the heart. Don't worry, even if you don't fully understand my words, I fully understand your hearts. Rest in that understanding. Our connection isn't based on your intelligence, but on my love." The burden of self-pity. When facing hardship, wallowing in self-pity can bring a distorted comfort at first, but it's a trap. It's a clinging burden that pulls us into a spiral of negativity and helplessness. Rest is the act of lifting your head, shifting your gaze from your own misfortunes to the greatness and goodness of God. The paralyzed man at the pool of Bethesda had been lying there for 38 years. When Jesus asked him, "Do you want to get well?" his answer was full of self-pity. "Sir, I have no one to help me into the pool." He focused on his helplessness and lack. Jesus didn't argue. He gave a command that broke the cycle. "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." He was saying, stop focusing on the burden of self-pity. Act in faith. Rest is not being pitted by others, but receiving the power to rise. Rest in the rhythms of life. A disorganized life, without rhythm, leads to chaos and weariness. Healthy habits, rituals like praying at a fixed time each day, reading a passage of scripture before bed, intentionally keeping the Sabbath are not binding rules. They are anchors, solid walls of a spiritual home that keep us from being swept away and provide a structure for rest. Daniel, though in a pagan land and a high official, maintained the habit of kneeling 3 times a day to pray and give thanks to his God. This habit was not a burden, but the source of his strength and rest in a court full of intrigue. So too with Jesus. He often withdrew to a desolate place to pray. He had a rhythm of life, a habit of returning to the Father. He teaches us that rest does not come naturally. It needs to be cultivated and protected with intentional habits. Rest is a weapon against despair. Despair is an overwhelming burden, like a wet, cold blanket. It whispers to us that there is no way out, no hope. In those moments, choosing to rest in God's promise, even when your emotions fight against it, is an act of combat. It is a declaration that we believe in the light, even when we only see darkness. When John the Baptist was in prison, he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, an act bordering on despair. Jesus' answer was not just a list of miracles. It was an invitation to rest in the evidence of God's power at work in the world. He said, "Even when your circumstances seem hopeless, look, the kingdom of heaven is still coming." Rest in that hope, and that very hope will become strength to fight against the burden of despair. The burden of what-if questions. If one of the most subtle forms of self-torture is replaying the past with what-if questions, what if I hadn't said that? What if I had chosen that path? This burden keeps us prisoners of an unchangeable past. Rest is accepting grace for the past, letting go of the what-ifs, and embracing what God has for us right now. After Jesus died, the disciples must have been tormented by what-if questions. What if we had stayed with him in the garden of prayer? What if I hadn't denied him? But when Jesus appeared to them, he didn't talk about those failures. His first words were, "Peace be with you." It was an invitation to rest from the burden of regret. He wasn't concerned with the what-ifs of the past. He was only concerned with giving them a new future, starting with his peace. Rest is learning to receive. Many of us, especially those with a strong sense of responsibility, are better at giving than receiving. Opening yourself to receive help, a compliment, or a gift can make us feel awkward because it touches our pride and self-reliance. But the burden of always having to be the giver is exhausting. Rest is learning the humility to become a receiver. When Jesus wanted to wash Peter's feet, he protested vehemently, "You shall never wash my feet." Peter wanted to be the servant, the giver. He wasn't used to receiving such a humbling act. Jesus had to say definitively, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." He was teaching an important lesson. To be in relationship with him, we must learn to receive. Receive forgiveness, receive grace, receive his love. Rest begins when we lower the weapons of self-reliance and open ourselves to receive. Rest in silent communion. In a world that exalts verbal communication, we feel pressured to always fill the space with conversation. But there is a deeper rest found in being able to be with someone without having to say anything at all. That comfortable silence is a sign of ultimate trust and connection. After a long, tiring day, Jesus and his three closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, went up the mountain for the Transfiguration. Before that glorious event occurred, perhaps they walked and sat together in silence. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he only asked them to stay here and keep watch with me. He didn't need them to offer advice or empty platitudes. He only needed their silent presence. He teaches us that coming to him sometimes doesn't require words. Simply bringing your presence and remaining still in that silent communion is also a deep form of rest. The burden of a divided heart. Jesus said, "No one can serve two masters." Trying to live for both God and the desires of the world, money, fame, pleasure, is a soul-tearing burden. It creates a constant tension and weariness because we are continually being pulled in two opposite directions. Rest is only found in singleness of heart, in a heart that decides to choose one master alone. The rich young man had kept all the commandments. He had tried to serve God, but he also served another master, wealth. His heart was divided. When Jesus asked him to give up the other master, sell all your possessions, he was inviting him to the rest of a unified heart. His burden wasn't wealth, but the division in his loyalty. He rejected that invitation and went away sad, continuing to carry the burden of a double-minded heart. Rest is allowing yourself not to know. We carry a burden of having to have answers for everything. Why does evil happen? Why do good people suffer? Why is God silent? Not having answers makes us feel insecure and weary. Rest is the humility to admit, I don't know, and to trust in the one who knows all things. When the disciples asked Jesus about the end of the age, he answered frankly, about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Jesus himself, in his humanity, showed rest in accepting the limits of understanding. He is teaching us not to carry the burden of having to know everything. Carry the burden of trusting. Peace is not in having all the answers, but in trusting the one who is the answer. The burden of unreasonable deadlines. We often set unreasonable deadlines for ourselves. I have to get over this grief in 1 month. I have to be successful before I'm 30. I have to break this bad habit immediately. When we don't achieve them, we carry the added burden of failure and self-reproach. Rest is shedding those human deadlines and trusting in God's timing, which is never hurried but always perfect. Jesus spoke of the kingdom of heaven through parables of gradual growth. Yeast causing the dough to rise, a mustard seed growing into a tree. He never spoke of instant development. He healed the blind man at Bethsaida in 2 stages. The first time, he only saw people as trees walking around. Then he laid his hands on him again, and he saw clearly. Jesus is teaching that healing and spiritual growth are a process. Rest. Don't be impatient. Trust that God is working on his timetable, not ours. Rest through a touch. In a world that is increasingly distant, we forget the power of a touch. A comforting handshake, a gentle pat on the shoulder, a hug can convey peace and acceptance more directly than 1,000 words. Jesus did not hesitate to touch the sick and outcast, and through that he gave them rest. The leper came to Jesus, carrying the burden of physical pain and social isolation. He only dared to plead from a distance. Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. The Bible records a touching detail. Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. According to the law, this act would make him unclean. But he broke every barrier to give this man not only healing, but also rest from the burden of not being touched by anyone for many years. Sometimes coming to Jesus is coming to be touched by him in your deepest and most painful place. The burden of a critical spirit. Constantly finding fault in others and in yourself is an energy-draining habit. A critical spirit causes us to always see the world through a negative and cynical lens. This burden makes it impossible to enjoy life. Rest is replacing the lens of criticism with the lens of grace, learning to see others and yourself through the eyes of God. In the story of the woman caught in adultery, the scribes and Pharisees approached with the burden of a critical spirit. They weren't interested in the woman. They only wanted to find fault with Jesus. Jesus shattered that burden with one sentence. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. He shifted their criticism from the woman to themselves. He was inviting them to lay down the burden of judgment and look inward. Rest comes when we stop throwing stones and start practicing mercy. Rest is trusting in the seed. When we do a good deed, speak a loving word, or plant a seed of faith, we often want to see immediate results. The burden of expecting outcomes can discourage us when nothing seems to happen. Rest is believing in the vitality of the seed sown and trusting that the one who makes it grow is working silently, even when unseen. Jesus told the parable of the sower. Some seeds fell on the path, some on rocky ground, some among thorns, and some on good soil. The sower only had one job, to sow. He couldn't control the type of soil, nor could he make the seed sprout faster. His job ended when the seed was scattered. He teaches us to do our part, sow seeds of love and truth. Then rest. Don't carry the burden of having to make it grow. That is our Father's work. The burden of vulnerability. Some people live with a heart so sensitive that they are easily wounded by a careless word or action. Constantly feeling offended and having to defend oneself is a perpetual burden. Rest is cultivating a stronger spirit in God's love. It's learning to let little things pass without disturbing inner peace. When the disciples were refused hospitality by a Samaritan village, James and John were angry and hurt. They said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" They were carrying the burden of an offended ego. Jesus rebuked them. He was teaching that rest isn't found in retaliation or proving oneself right. It's found in having a solid inner confidence and peace that the world's rejections cannot shake. Rest comes from healthy boundaries. We become exhausted because we allow others and their demands to invade all of our space and time. We don't know how to protect our energy and peace. Coming to Him also means learning to set necessary boundaries. Rest is not selfish, but a wise stewardship of what God has given us. Jesus loved and served the crowds, but He also knew when to withdraw. The Bible records many times that He went away privately, crossing to the other side of the lake, going up the mountain alone. He was setting a boundary. He was saying that His time with the Father and His rest were non-negotiable. He teaches us that to give sustainably, we must know how to protect our energy source. Good fences make good neighbors, and good boundaries make a good life. The burden of regret for wasted time. Looking back on life, many feel weary and regretful for years wasted, opportunities missed, and potential unrealized. This burden can paralyze the present and the future. Rest is believing that God is the Lord of time, and that He has the power to redeem even the years that we think the locusts have eaten and turn them into a part of His story of grace. The good thief on the cross lived a wasted and sinful life. He had no time left to redo things. His burden was probably immense regret, but he used his last moment to come to Jesus. And Jesus didn't dwell on his past. He gave him an immediate future. "Today you will be with me in paradise." That promise lifted the burden of a lost life and gave him rest in a moment. Rest is found in simplification. Modern life encourages us to accumulate more possessions, more relationships, more activities, more information. The burden of this complexity exhausts us physically and mentally. Rest often comes from a courageous decision to simplify, to cut out what's unnecessary to make more room for what truly matters. Jesus sent the disciples out on a mission with very simple instructions. Take nothing for the road. No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra tunic. He was teaching them about rest in simplicity and dependence. The burden of having to worry about too many material possessions would distract them from their main mission. A simple life leads to a free soul and a stronger faith. The burden of impatience. Impatience is a state of internal friction. We get angry because the red light is too long, because someone else is working too slowly, because God is answering a prayer too late. This inner turmoil is a major source of fatigue. Rest is cultivating patience, a fruit of the Spirit. Learning to accept the rhythm of life and trust in God's timing. Jesus, in the parable of the weeds, taught a profound lesson about patience. The servants wanted to go pull up the weeds immediately. They were impatient, but the master said, "No, let both grow together until the harvest." He had a long-term view and a patience based on wisdom. God teaches that the eagerness to clean things up right away can do more harm than good. Rest, be patient, and trust in the final harvest. Rest from the pressure to be interesting. In social relationships, we often feel pressure to appear intelligent, funny, or have interesting stories to tell. The burden of this performance makes it impossible to truly connect with others. Rest is being with someone with whom we can be completely ourselves, whether boring or silent, and still be accepted. When Jesus came to the house of Mary and Martha, Mary didn't try to impress him. She didn't talk about her accomplishments or ask intelligent questions. She simply sat at Jesus' feet and listened to him. She found rest in being allowed simply to be present and listen, without the pressure to perform. Our relationship with God is the same. He invites us to come, not to entertain Him, but simply to be with Him. The burden of being unable to forgive oneself. Many people may believe that God has forgiven them, but they cannot forgive themselves. They constantly torment themselves for past mistakes. This is a burden of subtle pride. When we set our standards even higher than God's forgiveness, rest is humbly accepting God's verdict on us, a verdict of acquittal, and stopping acting as our own judge. After Peter denied Jesus, he certainly couldn't forgive himself. He went back to fishing, carrying the burden of failure. But when Jesus met him again, he didn't say, "You must forgive yourself." Instead, he gave him a mission: feed my sheep. In doing so, he showed Peter that, in his eyes, his past didn't define his future. The best way to escape the burden of unforgiveness is to start living in the forgiveness and purpose that God has given you. Rest is found in beauty. We often become weary from being surrounded by the ugliness, the mundane, and the chaos of life. Taking time to stop and contemplate beauty, a flower, a piece of music, a painting, a sunset, is not a waste of time. It's a way for the soul to rest, to be lifted out of worldly cares, and connect with the one who is the source of all beauty. Jesus often used the beauty of nature to teach. He said, "Consider the lilies of the field. Even Solomon in all his glory was not dressed as beautifully as one of these." He's inviting us to rest through contemplation. Set aside the burdens of anxiety and take a minute to truly see the beauty that God has placed around us. A soul that knows how to appreciate beauty is a soul at rest. The burden of prayers based on achievement. Many of us carry the burden of feeling that our prayers are not good enough. We think that God only hears prayers that are eloquent, lengthy, or performed perfectly. The pressure to perform, even in prayer, exhausts us. Rest is believing that God hears even the most secret, simplest cry of a sincere heart. In the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, the Pharisee had a very long and impressive prayer, listing all his accomplishments. But it was a heavy prayer of ego. The tax collector, on the other hand, stood far off, wouldn't even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." His prayer was short and simple, but it came from a broken heart. And Jesus said that this man went home justified. Rest comes when we stop trying to impress God and start talking to Him authentically. Rest is escaping the echo chamber of our own minds. We often get trapped in an echo chamber of our own negative thoughts. One anxious thought leads to another, and another, creating a self-perpetuating loop that exhausts us. Coming to Him is an act of stepping out of that room to allow a new voice, the voice of truth, hope, and God's love, to interject and break the negative loop. After the disciples failed to cast out a demon from a child, they came to Jesus privately and asked, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" They were in the echo chamber of failure and self-doubt. Jesus didn't focus on their failure. He introduced them to a new voice, a new reality. Everything is possible for one who believes. He was inviting them to step out of the analysis of failure and into the space of God's power. Rest is allowing a voice other than the voice of our inner fears to have authority. The burden of ingratitude. An ungrateful heart never has enough. It's always looking at what it doesn't have, and therefore it is always in a state of restlessness and fatigue. Ingratitude is a burden that makes the soul barren. Conversely, gratitude is fertile ground where peace and joy can grow. Rest is found in the deep contentment of a heart that knows how to give thanks. As illustrated in the story of the 10 lepers, only the one who returned to give thanks received complete salvation. Jesus, before multiplying the loaves, did a simple act. He took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up to heaven, and gave thanks. He started a great miracle with gratitude for what little he had. He teaches that instead of complaining about the burden of lack, start with thanksgiving. Gratitude will open the door to rest and miracles. Rest is a legacy. The peace and rest that we cultivate in our souls isn't just for ourselves. It has a ripple effect. It becomes a gift, a legacy that we leave to our children, our families, and those around us. A father or mother who knows how to rest in God will teach their children how to face the storms of life with a different attitude. Lois and Eunice, Timothy's grandmother and mother, are mentioned as people with sincere faith. That faith certainly gave them an inner peace and rest, and that faith became the most precious legacy they passed on to Timothy, helping him become a steadfast leader of the early church. This shows that when we come to God to find rest, we're not only doing it for ourselves, but also sowing seeds of peace for future generations. The burden of having to pretend to be happy. In many cultures, including religious cultures, there is an unspoken pressure to always appear joyful and positive. Having to wear a mask of happiness while the heart is breaking is an incredibly lonely and exhausting burden. Authentic rest is finding a safe enough place to take off the mask, to be allowed to be sad, to be allowed to be weak without being judged. Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane, didn't pretend to be strong in front of his 3 closest disciples. He said plainly, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." He showed the utter honesty of his anguish. He didn't carry the burden of having to appear as an always steadfast teacher. In doing so, he sanctified our sadness and invited us to bring even our most authentic, unmasked sorrows to him and to a trusted community. Rest in the finished work. The deepest foundation of rest isn't in our efforts, not in trying to rest, trying to surrender, or trying to believe. That foundation lies in a historical event that has already occurred, the redemptive work of Jesus on the cross. His final words, "It is finished," are a declaration that the hardest work of bringing peace between us and God has been done. The New Testament writers often talk about us being seated with Christ in the heavenly realms. The posture of sitting is the posture of rest. It is the opposite of the standing posture of the priests in the Old Testament, who had to continually offer sacrifices because their work was never done. Our rest comes not from what we do, but from what we believe he has done. Coming to him is coming to rest in the accomplishment of the work he has already completed for us. Rest is a prophetic act. In a world spinning with anxiety, busyness, and fear, a person living with deep peace and rest in God becomes a sign. That peace cannot be explained by the logic of the world. It becomes a silent but powerful testimony to another kingdom, another reality, another king who is present. When the disciples were in the midst of the storm, their panic was a perfectly normal reaction according to the world's logic. But Jesus' rest, his sleeping, was a prophetic act. It declared that there is a power greater than the storm, that there is a peace that does not depend on circumstances. When we choose to rest in God amidst our own storms, we too are participating in that prophetic act. We are saying to the world around us, "My King is still in control." The burden of uncertainty. The fear of an uncertain future is one of the greatest burdens of humanity. We don't know what will happen tomorrow, for our jobs, for our families, for our health. This uncertainty creates a baseline anxiety. Rest is placing our hand in the hand of the one who not only knows the future, but also holds it. Jesus said to his disciples, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me." He said this right before he was about to suffer, at a time when their future looked the bleakest. He didn't give them a detailed plan of what was going to happen. Instead, he gave them himself. He is the only certainty in a world full of uncertainty. Coming to him is exchanging the burden of uncertainty for the assurance of his presence every step of the way. The final invitation is personal. After all the analysis and philosophy, we must return to the core and simplest truth. Jesus didn't say, "Come to a belief system," or "Come to a set of rules." He said, "Come to me." Rest is not a state that we can achieve on our own through technique. It is a gift given in a relationship. It's not a what, but a who. All the paths, the lessons, the truths are meaningless if they don't lead us to a personal encounter, a living connection with Jesus himself. The Apostle Paul, a man of great intellect, summarized his entire life not by what he knew, but by whom he knew. He said, "I know whom I have believed." The invitation, "Come to me," is the most intimate invitation in the universe. It's an opening to leave behind every burden of having to seek on your own, solve on your own, and simply step into the outstretched arms of the one who loved you before you even knew him. That is the starting point and also the destination of all rest. My friends, this concludes our journey together exploring 102 philosophies about rest from the timeless invitation of Jesus. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. We will close here. This isn't just a journey of knowledge, but a journey of the heart. Ton Duong Audio hopes that through these moments of reflection, you don't just know more about rest. For those who have truly felt that loving invitation calling out to them. Because, ultimately, rest isn't just a state of being, a destination, or some abstract idea. It's a position. It's Jesus Christ himself patiently waiting for us with open arms. Now, in this quiet moment, ask yourself, what burdens are weighing you down right now? And what philosophy has touched you most deeply? Share your feelings and your story in the comments below. Every share is a spark of light, and together we can build a community that listens to and supports each other in faith. If this video has brought you even a little bit of peace, please give it a like and share it with those you know who are also weary and in need of comfort. That's how we can become extensions of God's hands, together. And if you're new to the Ton Duong Audio channel, you're always welcome. Please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon next to it, so you don't miss out on any of the meaningful spiritual journeys that we'll be sharing with you in the future. May each and every one of you, wherever you are and whatever burdens you may be carrying, find true rest in coming to the Lord. Ton Duong Audio sincerely thanks you for listening and for your support. May the peace of the Lord be with you, and we'll see you in the next video. Music.